This shir is sponsored by Valerie Adler in honor of her niece, Dr. Ayelet Hoffman-Lipson. Like all of us who have listened to Ayelet's wonderful introductions in previous Masechta, I am looking forward with anticipation to hear her overview of Yevamot. This is an added pleasure for me in my journey with Hadran.
Welcome to the introduction to Seder Moed and Masechet Yevamot. Masechet Yevamot is well known as a very, very difficult Masechet. It's one of the Masechtot called Masechtot Ani. So the Rashei Tevot Ayin Nun Yud, Eruvin, Nida, and Yevamot. So once we get through this Masechet, we'll have done 2 out of 3. And Masechet Yevamot is, first of all, one of the longest Masechtot in the Talmud. And secondly, it's considered a very complicated Masechet because it deals with family relations. And we all know that family relations are often complicated. But also because it deals with very complicated kinds of relationships between different members of the family that are often difficult to chart out. And so I'm sure you'll see in any guides or books that you make use of that there'll be many, many charts, and you have to kind of really visually imagine the relationships in this Masechet. I want to say a few words about Seder Nashim in general before we start Masechet Yevamot. Seder Nashim is the third Seder of the Shas. And even though it's called Seder Nashim, it doesn't deal with halachot that only women have to fulfill, but rather it deals with the relationships between men and women. These relationships can be good relationships when a couple marries and everything works well, and the couple is dealing with the different rights and obligations that they have within their marriage. But these relationships can also go sour, and so we have the masechtot that deal with death, with divorce, with adultery, with arguments about the ketubah. So the order of the masechtot is Masechet Yevamot, which deals with a situation where a husband dies and leaves no children behind. Masechet Ketubot, which deals with the rights and obligations of both the man and the woman in the marriage. Masechtot Nedarim and Nazir, which deal with rights that the husband has with respect to his wife's vows. Masechet Sotah, which deals with a husband who is suspicious of his wife, of his wife's adultery. Masechet Gitin, which deals with the laws of divorce, and Masechet Kiddushin, which deals with the laws of the marriage. So you might notice that there seems to be, the order here seems to be wrong, right? We would assume that you would start with Kiddushin, with how do we construct the marriage, and perhaps end with the case of Yevamot, which is a more rare case where a husband dies and doesn't leave any children behind. And in between those two masechtot, we could have Masechet Ketubot, which deals with the rights and obligations within the marriage. Then we could have Gitin, which deals with divorce, which is a more common form of taking apart the marriage bond. So the question is, why is Yevamot actually the first tractate in this order, in this Seder Moed? So the main reason is that, and this is an opportunity to mention this, is that in general, all of the masechtot of the Mishnah are organized according to the length, the number of prakim that the Masechet has. So within the order, the masechtot are organized from the largest Masechet, in our case, Seder Nashim, it's Masechet Yevamot, which has 16 chapters, to the shortest Masechet, Masechet Kiddushin, which only has 4 chapters. And you'll see that the Masechtot are always organized in this way throughout the Shas. However, we can also look for a more essential or some kind of message that we can see in the ordering, because we're going to spend a lot of time learning Seder Nashim. So why did tradition preserve this kind of technical form of the ordering of the masachtot. We might have said, no, it's true that the masachtot are organized according to length, but it's more important to first learn the principles of masachtot that are more applicable, like kiddushin, like ktubot, and we'll postpone or only learn later masachtot which deal with a more rare instance. So I wanted to offer two answers here to this question. One is the answer that the Rambam gives in his Akdama Mishnah. The Rambam says that marriage in general, which is the main theme of this seder, is not something that you can coerce a person to engage in. It's not something that a Beit Din can go and say to a man, oh, you didn't get married, so now we're going to drag you to the Beit Din and give you a punishment. The only form or the only subset of halachot within Seder Nashim that you can coerce in this way are the laws of Yibum, and that's why the order starts from this set of laws. I want to suggest another principle that we can extract from Masechet Yevamot that is important for all of the order of Nashim. And in order to do so, we need to look at the psukim that deal with Yibum. And I think that looking at the psukim is also going to set us on the path of starting to derive some of the laws and terms that are going to be common throughout this Masechet, so it will be very helpful to us. So first of all, I want to think about the idea of Yibum. What is Yibum in general? Yibum is the idea that when a man dies and has no children, then his brother must marry the man's wife in order to produce children that will continue the deceased husband's name, okay? Now, this idea is found in Dvarim Kaf Hey, Dvarim 25, Psukim 5 and 6, where the Psukim say, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav, umet echad mehem, uben en lo, לא תהיה אשת המת החוצה לאיש זר, יבמה יבוא עליה ולקחה לו לאישה, ויבמה. So when brothers dwell together and one of them dies and leaves no offspring, the wife of the deceased shall not become that of another party outside the family. Her husband's brother shall unite with her, okay, that is the Yavam. He shall take her as his wife and perform the levir's duty. והיה הבכור אשר תלד יקום על שם אחיו המת, ולא ימחה שמו מישראל. So the eldest child that she bears shall be accounted to the name of the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. So this idea that a man can marry the wife of his deceased brother is an idea that stands in tension with an important isur, an isur karet, an isur of extirpation that is found elsewhere in the Torah. In Leviticus 20, we find a list of all of the arayot, all of the relationships, the forbidden relationships between different members of the family. And there in verse 21, the pasuk says, ואיש אשר ייקח את אשת אחיו, נידה היא, ערוות אחיו גילה, ערירים יהיו. So if a man takes the wife of his brother, it is irva, it is indecency. Sorry, it is nidah, it is indecency as it is translated here. It is the nakedness of his brother that he has uncovered. They shall remain childless. So in principle, if a man takes his brother's wife, that is seen as a terrible thing to do and a thing that actually will produce a childless union. On the other hand, when the brother is deceased, this is seen as a mitzvah of the highest order. So the same action can be, on the one hand, an isur karet, something that is very strictly forbidden. And on the other hand, the greatest chesed that a man can do with his deceased brother. So obviously the fact that the same action can be severely prohibited in certain circumstances and seen as a wonderful favor to have done in other circumstances creates very great anxiety and fear among Chazal, because they want to make sure that they are indeed determining the correct circumstances and that they are not creating a situation which will be an avera on something which is an isur karet. Okay, I want to also draw attention to the emphasis that we see here in the psukim on what exactly is happening. When a child is born from the new union of the brother and the deceased husband's wife, then says the pasuk, "Habechor asher teled yakum al shem achiv hamet, velo yimachesh shmo miYisrael." Notice this emphasis on the name, that the first child shall be accounted to the name of the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. And we see this emphasis also in the continuation of the psukim, which talk about the next part of the laws of Yibum, which is the laws of Khalitza. What happens when a man does not want to take his brother's wife as his own wife? ואם לא יחפוץ האיש לקחת את יבימתו, ועלתה יבימתו השרה אל הזקנים, ואמרה, מאין יבמי להקים לאחיו שם בישראל, לא אבה יבמי. So if the brother does not want to take his brother's widow, then the brother's widow shall appear before the elders in the gate and declare, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his brother. He will not perform the duty of a levir. Okay, so again, notice the emphasis on the name. וקראו לו זקני עירו ודיברו אליו ועמד ואמר, לא חפצתי לקחתה. The elders of the town shall then summon him and talk to him. And if he insists, saying, I do not want to take her, then וניגשה יבימתו אליו לעיני הזקנים, וחלצה נעלו מעל רגלו וירקה בפניו, וענתה ואמרה, ככה יעשה לאיש אשר לא יבנה את בית אחיו. So the brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and make this declaration. Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. ונקרא שמו בישראל, בית חלוץ הנעל. And again, the emphasis on the name. This man shall go in Israel by the name of the family of the unsandaled one. Okay, so this ceremony is intended as a very humiliating ceremony to the brother who refuses to continue the name of his deceased brother among the community of Israel. So we can see from this emphasis on the name that the principle that emerges from the psukim is that the main goal of the Yibum is to do a kind of chesed shel emet, okay, a kind of chesed that is done with the person who is dead, who can no longer repay that favor. And I think that this tells us something very important, not only about mitzvat Yibum, but also something about seder nashim in general. Because when we think of marriage from the perspective of the 21st century, we think of romantic love, we think of individuals fulfilling themselves within the couple. And the halakha certainly has that perspective, but the halakha has a dual perspective of marriage. So alongside this idea of romantic coupledom, the halakha also sees marriage very strongly as a framework which is intended to bring the family into the next generation, to produce children in order to continue the family, and in a way, through our children, to leave something of ourselves in the future, and even to eternity. And from that perspective, I think it's clear why we start from Masechet Yevamot, because when we think about Seder Nashim, then we first begin with the main purpose and aim of marriage, which is reflected very strongly precisely in this idea of the Yibum when something goes wrong. But it's reflecting to us the idea that ideally marriage is something where we are supposed to create a family that will continue on after us. And therefore, the brother who refuses to do that is treated so harshly because he's not ready to continue his brother's name into the next generation. And so Seder Nashim starts from this principle and only then moves to more technical questions of how is the marriage created? What are the rights and the obligations within marriage? How can marriage be annulled or taken apart in various ways? Okay, so that is, Yevamot is really introducing us to a very important principle of Seder Nashim as a whole. From the Psukim, I want to go out to some terminology and ideas that we'll be seeing again and again throughout the Masechet. So first of all, the Pasuk says that we're talking about a situation when uven en lo, so the man has no son. However, the Masechet understands this to mean, Chazal already earlier in Midrash Halacha, understand this to mean we're not only talking about a son, but any man who has no children requires yibum by his brother. It doesn't have to necessarily be sons. Secondly, the main people we're going to be talking about are the Yabam and the Yevamot. So the Yabam is the brother who needs to marry his deceased brother's wife. The Torah does not tell us which brother this should be. Chazal innovated that this obligation rests on the eldest brother. They actually use the pasuk that says V'haya ha-bechor, which in the verse itself relates to the eldest, to the child that will be created from the future union of the brother and the wife. But Chazal read it to be referring to the brother himself and not the future child. This probably also rests on a story, a biblical story, which is in the background of Mitzvat Yibum here, which is the story of Yehuda and Tamar, where we see that the order of the children who marry her is first the eldest remaining son, and then the next one. And that is indeed the way that the rabbis determined that the obligation moves on. The Yevamot is the woman who, the widow who is waiting to be married. The words in the pasuk ki yeshvu achim yachdav is understood by the rabbis to refer to brothers who were born before the man himself died, even if they were born just one day earlier. Okay, so that means that if a man died and he had a very young child, like in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, then the Yevamot could be in a situation that she would have to wait for many years, let's say at least 10 or 12 years, until the young brother would grow up and be able to release her from what is called Zikat Yibum. So Zikat Yibum is the connection between the Yabam and the Yevamot, which is created automatically as soon as the original husband died. Right away, there is the Zikat Yibum, which needs to be resolved either through Yibum, that the brother and the wife will, and the brother and the widow will marry, or through Khalitza, that the brother will release the widow through the ceremony of Khalitza. It's important to know that the laws of Yibum rest only on brothers from the father and not brothers from the mother. Another important term that is referred to throughout the Masechet already in the first Mishnah is the term of tzarot. This means that we have to think about the reality of polygamy. So if a husband had several wives, these wives are called tzarot to one another, right? Literally, they're trouble for one another. And there's only, if a man had several wives, it is enough for one wife to undergo yibum, and this releases the rest of the wives, and they are now able to marry any man that they want. According to Torah law, the relationship between the Yabam and the Yevamot is established only through bi'ah, through sexual intercourse, which according to Mishnah Kiddushin is one of the ways to get married. But the rabbis determined that there should also be a more official process of Kiddushin with kesef or shtar, with money or with a document. And this process is called ma'amar. That means that the Yabam needs to say the words Harei at mekudeshet li kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, like in a regular marriage. And this was done in order to create this as a formal marital bond, even though the bond actually exists between them automatically as soon as the original husband died. A few words about Khalitza. According to biblical law, the obligation to do Khalitza exists only if the husband actually refuses to marry, only if the Yabam refuses to marry the Yevamot. And its goal was to shame this recalcitrant brother into marrying the Yevamot. However, the rabbis seem gradually to take more and more into account the idea of Khalitza, and some rabbis, as we'll discuss in a moment, even prefer Khalitza over Yibum, and they seem to focus less on the obligation towards the dead brother and more on what is good for the widow and for the levir, so more for the Yevamot and the Yabam. And it seems that their concern was that the new family that was created by Yibum marriage or by Khalitza would function positively and wouldn't create strife between family members. And so some rabbis moved away from this idea of Yibum towards Khalitza. The Khalitza ceremony releases the woman entirely, and then she can marry anyone except a Kohen. She cannot marry a Kohen. However, even in the case of an Isur Kedusha, so a relationship between, let's say the woman who is now a widow was also before that a Grusha, a divorcee, and the brother is the Abam is a Kohen, nonetheless, Khalitza will be required. With time, the priority of Yibum became lessened already during the time of Chazal. We hear stories about different men, even men who did not have children while they were still alive, but wanted to save their wives the experience of Yibum or Khalitza. And therefore, we hear some stories in early rabbinic sources about men who married their wives and in the Kiddushin put in a stipulation that if they would die, the wives would not need Yibum, or others who when they were on their deathbeds and they didn't want their wives to have to go through Yibum, so they divorced their wives on their deathbed so that they would be considered divorcees, and then they wouldn't be widows and wouldn't need to undergo Yibum. We see a reflection of this in a Mishnah in Masechet Bechorot 1:7, which says that at first, Yibum was considered preferable to Khalitza, but now in our time, in the time of whoever is writing this Mishnah, mitzvat Khalitza kodemet lemitzvat Yibum. So the mitzvah of Khalitza is preferable to the mitzvah of Yibum. A scholar by the name of Mordechai Akiva Friedman suggested that this has to do with changes in the idea of reward and punishment from the time of the Bible to the time of Chazal. In the Bible, the idea of a person's reward is that reward is given in this world, like in the pasuk, "Leman yirbu yamehem v'yimei bnehem al ha'adama." So reward is that your days and the days of your children will be lengthened here and now on this land. By contrast, in the time of Chazal, the idea of reward and punishment has developed so that a person can suffer in this world but receive reward in the world to come. And therefore, there's no longer such a strong idea of the responsibility to lehakim zera, that a person's progeny will be present in this world. Rather, a person, the husband could die, not necessarily his brother will marry the widow and create children that will bear the original husband's name. And therefore, Yibum was no longer considered so significant, and Khalitza became the more idealized form of this mitzvah. However, we see that the argument about Yibum and Khalitza continued throughout the generations. In the time of the Geonim, for instance, after the Talmud, in the city of Sura, Yibum was more prevalent, while in the city of Pumbedita, Khalitza was more prevalent. In the Middle Ages in Europe, we find different practices. In the lands of Islam, then Yibum was much more prevalent than Khalitza. And when the different traditions came to Israel in 1950, there were takanot of the Rabbanut that determined that there would be no more Yibum in the land of Israel, and this probably reflected a European minhag. 1 year later, Rav Ovadia Yosef came out very, very strongly against this takana and said that the Jews from Islamic lands should continue to prefer Yibum over Khalitza, and this is an argument that we can see continued throughout the generations, a very, very complicated realm of law, both in terms of in legal terms and also obviously emotional terms. And I look forward to learning this long and complicated Masechet together with you all. Good luck and enjoy.